Today's totally far out 1970s computer shenanigans are brought to you by Squarespace. But more on that in a bit. Hi, I'm not Troy McClure, and you might remember me from such shenanigans as running a website from a raid of floppy disks, or overclocking a 90s industrial PC. Well, now I'm also the custodian of an irreplaceable piece of home computing history, a Sol 20 terminal computer. Is that a good idea? Who knows? But if you're at all interested in how we got to things that look like this, I think you're going to want to stick around and see what this blue beast can do. So stay tuned. And if you enjoy taking antique computers that should probably be in a museum somewhere, and probably trying to connect them to the internet, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. So this is arguably the most important home computer, and there's a good chance that you've never heard of it. It's the Sol 20 terminal computer, and quite literally, it was the first. You see, back in the early to mid 70s, if you were a computer enthusiast, you weren't just going out and buying a computer. Chances are you were buying bits of a computer and praying to the soldering gods that you put it together correctly. And even then, what did you wind up with? Blinking lights and front panel switches, and you had to buy a video terminal and even more gear if you wanted to actually type stuff in. In 1976, Apple pushed the envelope with a little computer called the Apple I, which came already soldered together for you, and it integrated keyboard and video circuitry right on the board. Of course, they expected you to build a power supply for it from scratch, obviously. Oh, and keyboard? Yeah, you can figure out a keyboard yourself. Just source it from somewhere and hack it to make it compatible. Well, it was into this miasma of early home computing innovation that a little company called Processor Technology unleashed the Sol 20. And it was like nothing else. Well, technically it was like a lot of those things. But the trick is, it was the first time that all of those things were combined into a single machine that you could just go out and buy. A keyboard, a power supply, video out, and an elegant case that you could just take home, turn on, and start using. An early vision of computers like the Apple II and the Commodore 64. But I actually think it's a lot more than that. And we'll talk about some of that once we get inside of this thing. But let's just take a moment and appreciate just how beautiful this machine is. The solid steel, yes, that's steel, this thing weighs a ton, is flawless and rust-free. The iconic blue paint has hardly a scratch in it, and the furniture finished walnut sides, well, they're absolutely beautiful. I've actually read some accounts of people trying to recreate these sides with modern walnut, and they found that this particular grain from the 1970s doesn't exist anymore. Anyway, I've been fascinated by the Sol 20 for years, ever since I saw Corey Cohen's machine from the Vintage Computer Festival. But these are nigh impossible to find, especially in anything resembling a good working condition. Estimates put this at about 5,000 machines sold in this configuration. And then, of course, in the late 70s, a lot more home computers started to come out that had a lot of the features the Sol had for a lot less money, like the Apple II and the silver behemoth that is the TRS-80. So when the opportunity arose to buy a somewhat working Sol 20, I jumped on it immediately, fully not expecting it to be in such absolutely beautiful condition. And I'm pretty sure that we can get this thing working. And that's what we're going to try and do today. So let's take a look at the current working state of this machine, and then we'll take it apart, talk about some of the things that make it really special, and then hopefully get it to a point where we can see some of the incredible things that it can do. Right after this word about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Create a fast, beautiful, and rich web experience for your business or brand using Squarespace's powerful all-in-one platform. It's really easy to get started. Like, say I wanted to build a website all about the incredible world of the Sol 20. Not only could I build it in minutes with Squarespace, but I could do it without writing a single line of code. There's a ton of beautiful templates that I could choose to start from, and from there, it's simple to build a great looking site that's also fast, responsive, and great on mobile devices. With Squarespace's extensive built-in toolset, I can also optimize for SEO, manage a mailing list, check my analytics, and much more, all geared towards managing your entire web presence. I'm so glad to have Squarespace as a longtime sponsor of this channel. So check out squarespace.com/actionretro today for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use code ActionRetro to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So I found this computer listed on an S100 vintage computer marketplace. We'll talk about what S100 means in a little bit. But the seller listed this as partially working but needs repair. And he showed a picture of what this thing does when you actually try and turn it on. Now, quick note, if you ever get an irreplaceable vintage computer or any piece of old tech, you should definitely take it apart and inspect it for damage before just powering it on. And I've actually done that just to make sure that there was nothing loose or broken in there since the time the pictures were taken. And yeah, I know this thing is pretty much safe to turn on, although 47-year-old electronics always carries some risk. But let me show you what this does when we power it on. This pattern on the screen might look like garbage, but it's not. This is actually a really good sign, and this is what I saw in the pictures. And when I looked it up, it turns out that this pattern of 9 and NO, which I think is supposed to be null, is what this computer does if it's working correctly but not loading any software. Not only does it have this pattern, but it has this flicker. And that flicker is a very good thing. It means that the processor is working. This thing is running and computing. And it just doesn't have anything loaded to compute. So I took it apart and cleaned some contacts on some of the interesting things we'll take a look at in a minute. And on a whim, turned it off and on a couple of times, and check this out. That right there, that's the prompt. This thing is booted into its operating system. And yes, that's right. This 1976 machine has an operating system that it boots into when you first turn it on, with text commands and everything. But there is a bit of a problem. Yeah, these keys do nothing. No input on the display. There is a light lit up on the local key, which I don't totally understand what that means yet. But pressing the uppercase key and shift lock key, yeah, that's right. This thing does uppercase and lowercase. Take that, Apple II. Hopefully, this is just because this keyboard is foam and foil, and the specific foam that they used in these key switches is notorious for breaking down. This thing is so heavy. I wouldn't be surprised if this weighs like 50 pounds. Anyway, to take this off, well, mine's missing the 2 screws that go here. But all we have to do, once we take out those 2 missing screws, is remove the fuse. And then the beautiful blue panel hinges up, showing our wonderful inside, including expansion slots. Yeah, that's right. This 1976 machine has a full array of expansion slots. And then, similarly, the front hinges up like this. The 2 pieces kind of hook together up top here. And here we have our, this is actually quite beautiful on the inside, especially with this solid, beautiful walnut. But let me show you some of the interesting things you're going to find in here. Well, first of all, good Lord, just look how big this capacitor is. It's like as tall as my finger and as big as my fist. But if we swap this thing around, here's the start of some of the really interesting stuff. These expansion slots I mentioned use the S100 bus, which was the very first standardized computer bus. This wasn't the first machine to use this bus. In fact, things like the Altair used it, but this machine made easy expansion via cards available in a home computer package. You can put memory cards in here, controller cards for floppy drives. Even more interesting though is this card here. This card is called the Personality Module, and this is what the operating system is on. And in fact, you could get different personality modules with different types of operating systems, some with more or less features, or there was even at least one third-party one of these. And turn the machine off, pop this thing out the back, and there is a special slot for this on the back of the computer, and you can change the personality of the computer. And that is just amazing for 1976 to be able to boot into an operating system. If you think about it, this is basically the 47-year-old equivalent of installing your operating system on an SSD. And how's this for even more equivalents to modern times? Take a look at these dip switches here. These 3 banks of switches, along with a 4th bank on the front of the machine under the keyboard, control a lot of the configuration options of this computer, such as the baud rate of the serial port, and also things like how does the display look? Is it black on white or white on black? You can control how the cursor looks and if it's blinking or steady, or no cursor if you prefer. But honestly, 47 years in the future here, this feels kind of like configuring a machine with its BIOS, only the BIOS on this machine is hard switches instead of software, but honestly, it's the same kind of concept. It's really like they saw into the future and built it with 70s technology. We'll probably wind up playing with these switches a bit later when we get this thing up and running. But for now, let's tackle this keyboard. I'm going to take this apart with my totally not sponsored Linus Tech Tips screwdriver that I unironically kind of really like. And yeah, this is flathead screws, which, when was the last time you saw a flathead screw in a computer? And look, there's somebody's math homework in here or something. Yeah, there's been some kind of cursed mod done here. You know, which of my old computers doesn't have a cursed mod in it somewhere? And I'm not quite sure what this is supposed to do. And unfortunately, a bunch of the wires have fallen off over the years. I did put this question out on Facebook, where there is an S100 group. And get this, we actually got a response from Mr. Lee Felsenstein himself, one of the original designers of this machine back in the 70s. How cool is that? Now, to get to the key switches in here, we don't actually have to remove any of the keycaps, which is quite nice. Instead, all we have to do is detach the PCB here, which has a somewhat annoying number of Torx screws, and that should give us full access. All right. So the way that these foam and foil switches work is these are actually capacitive pads. And when you strike a key, there's a little metal foam foil circle here, which depresses with the force of the foam into the capacitive pad and then springs back up, the foam actually acting kind of like a spring. However, these have all turned to complete dust. There is nothing left of any of these. They're all just kind of floating loose in here. But first, I want to make sure that the keyboard itself still works and doesn't have any fried components or anything. And we can kind of get a sense of that by just using our finger. because these are capacitive pads. If we plug this keyboard back in and get the computer back to its prompt, we should be able to trigger key presses by just touching these pads. All right, let's give this a try. All right, we got to a prompt. Let's give it the old finger test. It works. Haha, yes. Capacitive keyboard is keyboarding. We are using the Soul 20 right now. Amazing. All right, I am noticing that some of these pads are quite grimy, so I think I'm gonna take some rubbing alcohol to these to clean them as well. All right, so let's take a look at these foam and foil switches here. And yeah, they're basically just disintegrating even as I move this keyboard around. So on the bottom of each key switch is the little foil circle, which is supposed to be connected to the foam, but the foam is just completely disintegrated. Oh, this is very fragile. All right, so I popped this key switch out to look at it a little more closely, and it seems like the foam on mine was just glued to the plastic here. So I think we're just going to have to peel this off of every key, and that's going to be very tedious. And then to replace the foam and foil key switches, historically people have gone for this, a Sun Model 4 keyboard, and I've had a busted up one of these sitting around for a little while for just this occasion, but there's actually a better option than trying to reuse only slightly younger foam and foil. TechSelect actually offers them. That's right, TechSelect built a little rig to create brand new foam and foil pads. So this is what we're going to use. I think we might need to use a dab of glue in our particular key switches to attach these, but yeah, I'm hoping this will give us pretty much a stock experience. So if you need capacitive foam and foil pads, check out TechSelect, because shockingly and amazingly, they've got them. All right, so as it turns out, these new pads do actually snap in place. That's in there solidly. All right, so it is quite a while later, but I've got our keyboard completely foamified again, and I think it looks pretty good. It took quite a while with tweezers to scrape out all of the gunk. This is all the foam. It is just literally dust and glue. Disgusting. Anyway, let's pop this back together with the PCB and see if we've got a working keyboard. All right, we're at the prompt. Huh. There's a lot of key repeat. And some of the keys aren't even working. Uh-oh. Although I kind of have an idea what might be going on, because this computer isn't supposed to have key repeat. In fact, there's a repeat key on here that I think how it works is you hold it down when pressing a key, and that causes key repeat. I have an idea. Let's check something. Remember this weird mod that was hacked onto the back of the keyboard here? Well, it is now completely fallen off, but one of the suggestions from that Facebook group is that this is or was a key repeat mod. And I think they're right, if you'll notice, there's also this big long bodge wire here, and it's actually starting at the repeat key. So I'm pretty sure how this works is when you pressed a key, this would remember that key, and then this would trigger the key repeat key, and then repeat the key you pressed. And this would control maybe the delay, this potentiometer right here, or maybe it would control the speed of the repeated key. But I'm pretty sure this is the problem, since it's not connected correctly anymore. It's just, this is just immediately triggering that repeat button and holding it down all the time, basically. Okay, actually, I found a lifted pin on this chip here, which looks like it was at one point connected to that mod. So I'm going to take this chip out and reseat that pin. And I like to use a little bit of magic eraser with rubbing alcohol on it to spruce up the pins, because they are a little bit corroded. Okay, well now key presses work correctly, but not all of the keys are working. All right, we're getting there. Okay, so testing this with the keys off, these all seem to work. One thing I noticed though is some of these are kind of covered in dust from the old rotten foam. So let me re-clean this off. We'll try it again, because I think this keyboard is fully working. Okay, so I cleaned off the pads again using this ECG electronics wash, and definitely got more grime off of the capacitive pads. And I also reseated all of the foam pads. And yeah, now a lot of the keys seem to be working, but not 100% of them. And I do have an idea why that might be. Oh yeah, look at that. Delete doesn't repeat, but if I hold the repeat key and then press delete, it does repeat. That's pretty cool. Now what I'm really curious about is, do we have the personality card that has the terminal baked in? So let's zoom in. Maybe uppercase. Hey, I think it's going into the terminal program, because that's actually a big feature of this machine. It is both a terminal, like a 70s terminal, and a computer, and you can switch between the two in software. So yeah, we're going to be able to get this thing on the internet. But I'm going to call this video here. It's already getting quite long, and I'd say we're about 90% of the way to a fully functional Saw 20. Amazing. I think the issue with the keyboard is that those foam switch replacements are just a little too short for this keyboard. I think this might be an earlier version of the keyboard. I think later ones had a different way of snapping keys in that maybe held the foam down a little bit further. I think what I'm going to do is get some double-sided tape and stick that on the other side of the little foam dealies, and that'll both keep them stuck in place and give it just a little bit more length to tap on the capacitive pads. And then of course the big thing, I really need to figure out why this only boots maybe 1 out of every 5 power-ons. I'm sure it has something to do with the power supply, and I'm gonna have to get out a multimeter and try to figure it out, although I'm not an expert. If any of you have ever had experience with this kind of thing and you have some pointers, I'd be happy to hear them down in the comments below. But in the next video, hopefully we'll be able to dig a little bit deeper into the really cool features of this thing and maybe even get it on the internet. But if you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more of these 1970s computing shenanigans, please subscribe down below, and thank you very much for watching. And a special thanks to Alex Hoffman, Camilo Noceda, Chris Allegretta, Chris Biggs, Chris Calderon, Chris Nelson, Control-Alt-Reese, Daniel Hubbard, Greg from Hrutk Mods, Justin Hemmings, Justin Reed, Megahertz Models, Michael Mulhern, Paul Spencer, Ryan, Scott Thompson, Sutek, Tom Woodfin, and Unknown Soldier 41, who are my highest tiered patrons and all of my Patreon supporters who help to make these videos possible.